The shrill whistle cut through the pre-dawn air, dragging Minjan from uneasy sleep. His wife Sujan stirred beside him, her face pale and drawn. Their son, Jiho, curled tightly under a thin blanket, coughed in his sleep. Min Chen's stomach growled, but there was no time to think of hunger. The mines waited, as they always did. The walk to the pit was a march of ghostmen in tattered coats, heads lowered, feet crunching over frost-bitten earth. No one spoke. They never spoke. Even whispers could be overheard and twisted into crimes. At the entrance, Korean soldiers stood tall, rifles slung across their shoulders, eyes scanning every face. One soldier caught Minshan's gaze a moment too long. Minjon quickly bowed, forcing his expression into something unreadable. The soldier smirked before waving him on. Inside, the mine swallowed them whole. Darkness pressed on all sides, broken only by the weak glow of lamps that flickered like dying stars. The air was thick with dust, scraping down into the lungs with every breath. Minjan lifted his pickaxe and struck the rock. Again. Each blow sent shudders of pain up his arms. His hands were already blistered, skin cracked and bleeding, but he dared not slow. Weakness was punished. He had seen it before. The memory haunted him, the miner who collapsed last winter. The man's knees buckled, and his body crumpled to the ground. For a moment, silence had filled the tunnel. Then came the boots. The Korean soldiers descended on him like wolves, shouting that he had shamed the leader by failing in his duty. They kicked until his body stilled, then dragged him away. Days later, whispers said his family vanished too. Minjun had wanted to cry that day, to shout, to rage. But instead, he gritted his teeth and swallowed his tears. Even here, grief was dangerous, or weakness. Weakness was betrayal. Betrayal meant death, now. As his pick struck the rock again, dust stung his eyes, and for a moment he felt the burn of tears rising. Quickly he bit his lip, hard enough that the taste of iron filled his mouth. Blood over tears, always. Ours bled into one another. The only rhythm was pickaxes striking stone, men grunting, rocks tumbling. When the horn finally sounded for the end of the shift, Minchun's body sagged, but his face remained impassive, expressionless. That was survival. As he climbed out of the pit, daylight stabbed his eyes. The Korean soldiers stood waiting, rifles gleaming, watching the men shuffle past. No one dared limp, no one dared cough. They passed like cattle under the cold gaze of masters. Minjin did not cry. He never cried. But deep inside, beneath the silence and stone, a dam of hidden tears grew heavier each day, and he knew someday something would break. The walk back from the mine was slower, though not by choice. Every step felt like dragging chains through the dirt. The other men shuffled along with hollow eyes, the Korean soldiers following close behind to ensure no one strayed, no one lingered, no one dared whisper. The silence was unnatural, but in North Korea, silence was safety. Minjan reached his shack by nightfall. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the stale air of poverty greeted him like an old enemy. Inside, Sujan sat cross-legged on the floor, her face lit by the faint glow of a dying candle. In her lap, she held a pot. It was empty except for a thin trace of watery broth. Jiho sat beside her, his cheeks sunken, his ribs sharp against his skin. Minchin's heart twisted at the sight. He wanted to embrace his son, to tell him it would be all right, but lies were too heavy to speak. Instead, he lowered himself to the floor, exhaustion weighing down his bones. Sujan glanced at him, her eyes saying what her lips could not. "There is no food." "I managed to trade for this," she whispered, sliding a single corncob across the floor. Its kernels were few, shriveled, and pale. Then Jun picked it up, turning it over in his hands like it was treasure. In truth, it was. Jiho reached for it eagerly, but Sujian stopped him. "Slowly," she murmured, her voice cracking. She tore off a kernel and placed it on his tongue as if feeding him gold. The boy chewed noiselessly, savoring every grain. The silence in the room was broken only by Jiho's chewing. Outside, the faint echoes of loudspeakers blared propaganda into the night, praising the leader, promising that the nation thrived. The voice was calm, commanding, filled with lies. Minjun clenched his fists. Thriving? Ah. His family sat in darkness, gnawing on scraps, living on emptiness. But anger, like tears, was dangerous. He forced his expression blank. "Tomorrow," Sujian whispered. "What will we do tomorrow?" The question hung heavy. There was no answer. Work brought no food. Rations had long disappeared. Trading was dangerous, punishable if discovered. Starvation was the only certainty. Minjun swallowed hard. His family looked to him for strength, but inside, he was crumbling. When Jiho finally fell asleep, curled against his mother, Minjun stared at the boy's fragile body. A father was supposed to provide, protect, yet here he was, powerless, crushed under stone by day and by hunger at night. He leaned his head against the wall, eyes closing, but sleep did not come. Only the sound of his son's shallow breathing, the gnaw of hunger in his belly, and the echo of the mine hammering inside his skull. Tomorrow would come, and with it, more stone, more silence, more hidden tears. Morning came not with sunlight, but with the shrill whistle outside, sharp as a blade. Minjun jolted awake, careful not to disturb Jiho, who still clung to his mother's sleeve even in sleep. His body ached from the mines, his stomach burned with emptiness, but the world outside offered no mercy. The whistle meant assembly. He stepped into the cold street, joining the crowd of gaunt faces that shuffled toward the square. The Korean soldiers stood in formation, rifles gleaming, eyes scanning every man, woman, and child. It wasn't a gathering for the people, it was a warning to them. In the center of the square, a man knelt with his hands tied behind his back. His face was swollen, his lips split, but it wasn't the injuries that drew the villagers' stares. It was the sign hung around his neck, "Traitor of the Motherland." Minchun's breath caught. He knew the man, Mr. Han, a neighbor who had once given Jiho a piece of dried fish when he was sick. Han had been quiet, kind, never reckless, yet here he was, trembling under the gaze of the Korean soldiers. The loudspeaker crackled. A booming voice declared Han guilty of spreading rumors, of questioning the greatness of the supreme leader, of weakening the spirit of the nation. The words were sharp, rehearsed, but Minjun could hear the lie. Han's only crime was speaking truth in a land where truth was forbidden. The Korean soldiers yanked him to his feet. The crowd was ordered to clap. Minchun's palms stung as he struck them together, his face a mask of obedience, but inside his chest raged a storm. Jiho had once asked why they had to clap for things they didn't understand. That question now echoed in Minchun's mind, as he forced his hands to move, each clap a betrayal of his own soul. Then the gunshot came. One crack, loud enough to split the morning. Han fell forward, his body crumpling like a broken doll. Silence followed thick, suffocating. Minchun's hands froze mid-clap. He lowered them slowly, careful not to let his eyes betray him. Around him, others forced their faces into expressions of loyalty, some even smiling too widely, clapping harder, desperate to prove themselves safe. The Korean soldiers scanned the crowd, searching for hesitation, for weakness, for any sign of dissent. Minjun dropped his gaze, heart hammering. He felt sweat bead at his neck despite the chill. He thought of Jiho, of Suyan. If he faltered, if he betrayed even the smallest doubt, they would suffer with him. When the assembly ended, the villagers dispersed in silence, each step heavy with unspoken fear. Minjun walked back to the mine, his mind haunted by Han's fall. The message was clear. North Korea's survival meant silence. Survival meant clapping when told, bowing when commanded, and never allowing the truth to escape your lips. The mine swallowed Minjun whole. As he stepped inside, the air grew colder, heavier, filled with dust that clawed at his throat. The tunnels stretched endlessly into darkness, lit only by weak lamps that flickered, as if they too wanted to escape. Every strike of the pickaxe was not just against stone, but against his body, each swing tearing muscle and hope alike. Around him, men coughed violently, their skin stretched thin over bones. No one spoke. Words were dangerous here. A wrong whisper could be reported, twisted into treason. So silence ruled, broken only by the clatter of rocks and the barked orders of the Korean soldiers. A sharp crack echoed through the tunnel. Minjun flinched, turning to see a young miner collapse, blood trickling from his head. The boy had paused too long, leaning against his shovel, his knees trembling from exhaustion. A Korean soldier stood over him, rifle raised, eyes cold as stone. "Work is loyalty," the soldier spat. "Weakness is betrayal." The boy groaned, but no one moved to help. Minchun's hands shook as he forced himself back to his pickaxe. He wanted to help, but fear rooted him in place. The boy was dragged out, his cries fading into the darkness. Hours bled into eternity. Sweat stung Minchun's eyes, his back screamed in pain, and still he swung. Every time he slowed, he felt the eyes of the Korean soldiers burning into him. He remembered Mr. Han's execution, the way the crowd had been forced to clap. Here in the mine there was no applause, only silence, enforced by the threat of death. When the shift finally ended, Minjun staggered out into the gray daylight. His face and clothes were caked in dust, his lungs raw. The rations they were given afterward, a handful of cornmeal and watery soup, barely registered as food. He forced himself to eat, every bite bitter with the knowledge that it would never be enough. Later, when he returned home, Jiho tugged at his sleeve. The boy's eyes were wide, innocent, too young to understand the weight his father carried. "Appa," Jiho whispered, "why do the Korean soldiers hurt people if we are all loyal?" Minjan froze. Sujan quickly hushed the boy, pressing him to her chest. She shot Minjun a look fear, mixed with sorrow. Questions like that could destroy them. That night, lying on the floor of their hut, Minjen listened to the wind rattling the walls. He closed his eyes, but the silence of the mind followed him. Silence that was not peace, but suffocation. Silence that crushed him more than any stone. He buried his face into his arm, his chest trembling. Tears threatened to rise, but he bit them back. In North Korea, even crying was dangerous. Tears could betray you. So he swallowed them, forcing them deep inside, where no one, not even his family, could see. North Korean village, the winter crept in like a thief, stealing what little warmth the village had left. Smoke from thin fires clung to the rooftops, but it brought no comfort, just the smell of desperation. Minjan returned home one evening, his body broken from the mines, and found Suyan crouched beside their son. Jiho lay on the floor, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. His skin was pale, lips cracked, and his small chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. His eyes, usually bright with curiosity, fluttered weakly. "He hasn't eaten since morning," Sujin whispered, her voice breaking. "He vomited up the little porridge we had." Minjin knelt beside his boy, pressing his calloused hand to Jiho's forehead. It burned with fever. A cold fear spread through him, heavier than the mind stones. Illness here was a death sentence. The clinics were reserved for the elite, and even then, medicine was a luxury few saw. For families like theirs, sickness meant a silent burial. Jiho stirred, his voice faint. "Appa, am I in trouble for not bowing properly?" The words cut deeper than any wound. Tears threatened to rise, but Minjin clenched his jaw, swallowing them down. "No, my son," he said softly. "You've done nothing wrong. It's Appa who must be stronger." That night, Sujian tried to boil water with a few crushed herbs she had hidden away, praying it would help. But Minjan knew it wasn't enough. Jiho needed food, real food, something with strength in it. Cornmeal and grass porridge could not save him. The next morning, after another suffocating shift in the mines, Minjun slipped away instead of returning straight home. His legs carried him toward the edge of the village, where the black market whispered like a forbidden secret. Hidden in shadows, men and women bartered scraps of rice, smuggled medicine, and dried fish, short traded at the risk of execution. If the Korean soldiers caught them, he had nothing to offer but his labor-worn hands. He begged one trader for rice, even a handful. The man scoffed, shaking his head. But when Minjan offered his old pickaxe, the only tool he had left from before the mine, the man hesitated, then tossed him a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were 3 shriveled potatoes. It wasn't enough, but it was something. When Minjan returned, Suyan's eyes filled with tears at the sight of the potatoes. She boiled them carefully, feeding Jiho small bites. For the first time in days, color returned to the boy's cheeks. But Minjan knew this was temporary. Potatoes would not save him from fever, and the Korean soldiers would soon notice his missing pickaxe. That night, as Jiho slept more peacefully, Minjun lay awake, staring at the roof beams. The weight of silence pressed down again. The mine had its dangers, but the greater danger was here, in his own home, where his child's life hung by a thread. And he knew tomorrow he would have to risk more, much more. The moon hung low, veiled by smoke from the village chimneys. Minjun walked quietly, keeping to the shadows of cracked walls. Every step weighed down by the knowledge that Jiho's life depended on what he found tonight. The black market wasn't a place of choice. It was the last breath of desperation for families like his. The alley near the river buzzed with hushed voices. Old women squatted with baskets of foraged herbs. Men in ragged coats guarded bundles wrapped in cloth. A few children lingered, their thin arms clutching scraps of corn they hoped to trade. But beneath the low murmurs was the constant fear. Every transaction could be their last. Korean soldiers patrolled the borders of the village with merciless eyes. If they discovered the trade, punishment was immediate. Prison camps, beatings, even execution. The market thrived only in stolen moments of darkness. Minjun approached a trader with sharp, hungry eyes. "Do you have medicine? Anything for fever?" he whispered, his voice trembling with urgency. The man laughed bitterly. "Medicine? It's worth more than your life. Do you have money?" "Yeah, nothing but labor," Minjun admitted, desperation cracking through his words. "Please, my son is sick. He may not survive the week." The trader studied him for a moment, then leaned closer. "There's a shipment tonight smuggled across the river. Food, medicine, even antibiotics. But if you're caught near it, you won't live to see your son again. Are you willing?" Minchun's breath caught. A chance, a risk. The silence of the mines had taught him to obey, but his son's shallow breaths reminded him that silence could kill too. "I'll do it," he said firmly. Before the trader could respond, a shout cut through the air. Korean soldiers stormed the alley, boots slamming against stone, rifles raised, panic erupted. Women clutched their baskets, men scattered like shadows, children vanished into doorways. Legal traitors. One soldier roared, striking a man across the face with his rifle butt. Another soldier grabbed a woman's bundle, tearing it open. Fish spilled onto the ground. Minjun froze, his heart hammering. He pressed against the wall, trying to blend into the darkness. But the traitor had already fled, leaving Minjun with nothing but fear. A soldier's flashlight beam swept dangerously close, grazing Minchun's boots. He held his breath, praying to remain unseen. His mind raced with Jiho's fevered face, Suian's tired eyes, the smell of boiled potatoes that wouldn't be enough. Finally, the soldiers moved on, dragging two unlucky men with them. Their screams echoed down the alley, swallowed by the night. Minjun exhaled shakily, his legs trembling. The black market had almost cost him his life, but he could not stop now. His son's time was running out. And if medicine existed across that river, he would have to find a way to cross it no matter the cost. The river was more than water. It was a line between despair and the possibility of hope. Between the cold fist of North Korea and the faint breath of freedom. Minjun had stared at its dark currents many nights from the mine's edge, always too afraid to imagine crossing. But tonight, Jiho's shallow breaths echoed louder in his mind than the roar of the current. The trader's words replayed in his head. A shipment tonight, medicine, food. Across the river. That chance, slim and shrouded in danger, was all he had left. He crept along the path, keeping to the trees. His patched coat was heavy with dampness, and every crunch of leaves beneath his shoes made him flinch. He could hear the distant bark of dogs, the bark that meant Korean soldiers were near. At the riverbank, shadows moved. 3 other men were already there, their faces gaunt, eyes darting with paranoia. They carried sacks strapped to their back straighters, smugglers, survivors, just like him. One of them hissed at Minjun. "Are you mad? Coming here without a plan?" The Korean soldier shoot first, question later. "I just need medicine," Minjun whispered, voice trembling, but resolute. "For my son." The man stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Then you'll have to follow us. But if you slow us down, you'll be left behind." The current shimmered in the pale moonlight, icy and unforgiving. A faint glimmer of the opposite bank teased Minchun's hope. But along the riverbank, the glow of lanterns betrayed the patrol routes of Korean soldiers. Their boots crushed the reeds, Their rifles gleamed in the night. Minjun dropped to his knees, pressing himself into the mud as two Korean soldiers passed dangerously close. He could hear their voices, sharp and arrogant. "Another smuggler caught last week," one said, spitting into the dirt. "Dogs tore him apart before we fired." The other laughed cruelly. "That's what happens when they think they can defy the marshal." Minchun's fists clenched in the muck, nails digging into his palms. He wanted to scream, to cry, but he forced the tears back. Crying was weakness. Weakness was death. The smugglers signaled. One by one, they slipped silently into the river. Minjun followed, the shock of the freezing water cutting into his bones. Each step forward felt like drowning, his breath ragged, the current dragging him sideways. Then a shout split the night. A soldier had spotted them. Lanterns flared, gunshots cracked. Bullets splashed into the water around him, sparks of death chasing their desperate bodies. Minchun's heart pounded as he forced himself forward. His lungs burned, his legs faltered, but Jiho's fevered face kept him afloat. Freedom moored to Thlay, only a few strokes away. The night exploded with chaos. Bullets cracked like thunder, each one slicing the river's surface with violent splashes. Minchun's chest seized with terror as he thrashed through the freezing current, trying to keep his head above the water. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body numb from cold. But the thought of Jiho's pale, fevered face gave him strength he didn't know he had. The smugglers ahead scattered in panic. One vanished beneath the water without a sound, dragged under either by the current or a bullet. Another screamed as a shot ripped through his shoulder, his cry swallowed by the rushing tide. "Stop, halt or die." Korean soldiers shouted from the bank, their rifles flashing in the darkness. The beams of their lanterns danced across the water like hunting knives. Minjun ducked beneath the surface, the icy water searing his lungs. He swam blindly, kicking hard, forcing himself to ignore the burning pain. When he emerged gasping for air, he was closer to the far bank, closer to the promise of medicine, of hope. But the Korean soldiers were relentless. Their boots pounded along the riverbank as they followed, firing into the water. One bullet tore into the man beside Minjun, who let out a strangled cry before sinking, blood blooming around him like ink in the current. "Go back, traitor," a soldier bellowed. His voice was young but filled with hatred. "Better to drown than face our marshal's wrath." Minchun's teeth chattered violently, half from cold, half from fear. He could barely feel his arms anymore, yet he forced them to move, inching toward survival. Behind him, the crack of gunfire echoed again. He could almost feel the bullets cutting the water near his back. For a brief moment, the current carried him into the shadow of tall reeds. He pressed himself low, trying to stay hidden, as the Korean soldiers shouted orders on the bank. Their lanterns swept the river, searching for any sign of him. His chest ached, his body trembling violently, but he dared not move. Then, from the opposite shore, faint voices called out in a foreign tongue. The smugglers who had made it were urging him on, their silhouettes waving frantically. He was so close now, just a final push away, summoning every last ounce of strength. Minjun lunged forward into the current once more. The river fought him, dragging him sideways, but he clawed at the water, his eyes fixed on the dark outline of freedom. Behind him, the Korean soldiers screamed and fired again. The bullets followed him like curses, chasing him to the very edge. Minchun's hands finally caught the muddy bank. With a hoarse cry, he pulled himself up onto foreign soil, soaked, shaking, but alive. For the first time in years, he dared to believe he might have a chance. North Korean rivershore Minjun collapsed on the far shore, his body trembling violently as if every bone in him rattled with the cold. He lay face down in the mud, coughing up river water, unable to believe he was still alive. The gunfire had faded, though the shouts of Korean soldiers still echoed faintly across the river, like the growls of beasts too far to reach him now. But freedom did not feel the way he had imagined. There was no sudden lightness, no triumphant roar within his chest. Instead, there was only exhaustion and a terrible ache of guilt. He had left behind the faces of men who had been shot, men who would never make it across. He had left behind his mother's trembling hands, his sister's hollow cheeks, their survival still uncertain. The smugglers who survived pulled him to his feet, urging him deeper into the shadows. No time to rest, one of them hissed. The border guards on this side won't protect you. They find you, they'll send you back or worse. Minjun stumbled after them, each step heavy, his soaked clothes clinging to his skin like chains. His teeth chattered uncontrollably, yet his mind spun faster than ever. He had crossed the river, but what had he really achieved? He had no money, no food, no shelter, only the fragile hope of medicine for Jiho. As they trudged through the darkness, his thoughts returned again and again to the image of his sister's frail body lying on the floor. He whispered her name like a prayer, as if the sound of it could keep her alive until he returned. But deep down, he knew time was against him. Hours later, when the group finally reached a safe house, Minjun was thrust into a dim, unfamiliar room. The air smelled of foreign tobacco and sweat. He was given dry clothes and a bowl of rice. Devoured it in seconds, though guilt gnawed at him. Every bite he ate felt stolen from Jiho's mouth. The smuggler leader looked at him with cold, calculating eyes. "You crossed the river for medicine, yes?" he asked. Minjun nodded weakly. "Then you must work for it. Nothing here is free." Minchon's heart sank. He had imagined freedom as an escape from chains, but already he could feel the weight of new ones tightening around his wrists. Even here, beyond the river, survival demanded a price he was not sure he could pay. That night, as he lay on a straw mat in the corner, sleep eluded him. He stared into the dark, hearing Jiho's weak voice in his memory. He had survived the river, yes, but the true battle was only beginning. Dawn crept into the safe house with pale light slipping through the cracks of the boarded windows. Minjun sat upright, his back against the wall, unable to sleep. His body ached from the journey, but it was nothing compared to the torment inside him. He was alive. He had crossed the river, yet his sister might already be gone. The smugglers spoke in hushed voices in the other room. When they finally called him, their demands were simple and cruel. Work for them smuggling contraband, or pay with money he did not have. Only then, they said, would they help him send medicine back across the river? Minchun's heart clenched. He had escaped one set of masters only to find another. But Jiho's sunken eyes haunted him, eyes that pleaded not for her own life, but for him to keep living. Could he abandon her now? Could he condemn her to the slow death that claimed so many children in their village? The smuggler leader slid a small packet of medicine across the table, the pills wrapped in thin paper. This could save her. But to send it, you will work. His voice carried no mercy, only transaction. Minjun reached for the packet, his hands trembling. He imagined Jiho coughing weakly, her lips cracked, her tiny fingers gripping their mother's sleeve. He thought of how many nights she had whispered to him, asking what the outside world was like, asking if food really grew in abundance somewhere else. He had no answer then. Now he had only this one fragile chance. "Yes," he said at last, his voice low but steady. "I'll work." The smugglers exchanged looks, then nodded. The choice was sealed. Freedom was not free, and survival demanded its toll. That night, Minjun walked outside for the first time since crossing. The air smelled different, less heavy, less controlled, yet strangely foreign. He looked toward the river in the distance, its waters glinting faintly under the moonlight. Somewhere beyond that black line of water lay his mother and sister. He pressed the packet of medicine to his chest, whispering Jiho's name into the wind. Tears welled in his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. In North Korea, crying was weakness. Here he did not know what it meant, but for him, it was both grief and defiance. Minjun did not know if he would ever see his family again. He did not know if Jiho would live long enough to receive the medicine. But he knew one thing. As long as he breathed, he would fight. For her. For freedom. For a life where tears were not punishable, and where love did not have to be hidden in silence. And with that vow, he stepped into the darkness, carrying both the weight of freedom and the unbearable hope of a brother's love.